Hi everyone and welcome to Run the Gauntlet. This is a program where I, Cate Hogan, Developmental Editor, take scenes, opening scenes that you guys send me, and I apply and edit a developmental critique in real time so that the writer can get a really clear idea of what's working in the scene, where there are opportunities to tap into more of the dramatic or thematic potential of the scene. And by really generously allowing me to record this feedback and share it with you guys, we also get to take other writers along for the journey, share in the insights gleaned, and hopefully form a little bit of a conversation and community as we, embark upon this process. So I'm really glad you could join me today. Thanks for watching, and I'm very excited to share A Long Way Home, which is today's opening scene is going to be from this work in progress. It's a historical novel. It's from the Civil War era. And the writer is Denise Senecal, who is a lovely person, but also a fantastic writer who's very generously shared her work today. Denise has been working on this novel for 30 years on and off. She's been doing that while also being a single mom. So go Denise, amazing. She's lived in Texas where this story is set. And she grew up on a diet of Westerns and really diverse kind of literature. And I think you'll see that reflected in her manuscript somewhat in terms of, I think it has a really, really lovely kind of earthiness and authenticity, and it almost feels like it's kind of sprouted out of the earth that is planted in. There's a really nice sense of, I think, depth and understanding to Denise's writing, which is one of the reasons I really wanted to focus on it today. And Denise has very broad writing interests. She's right into Vikings and sci-fi, and she's working on historicals and also following the Wagner family, who we will be meeting today. So I think that we're going to have a lot of fun exploring this very dynamic and very dramatic opening scene, and also hopefully finding some great opportunities to develop what is already a really captivating kind of introduction to the story. Without further ado, let's jump straight into it, and I really want to try a slightly different approach this episode as well. Sometimes I do a real deep dive into a longer segment of text, and I was really drawn to this particular scene because so much happens in such a short period that it offers a lot of really good elements to explore. But I'm going to try and keep it relatively concise today, not go on and on as you might know I love to, and instead embrace a less is more approach. So with that said, let's immediately jump into this opening scene. I'm going to read the scene to you first. I've kind of broken it into parts. I'm going to start with the first part of the scene. I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to go back and deconstruct or offer some developmental recommendations before we then read the next section and deconstruct that. So, chapter 1. Abby Wagner followed the path downstream along the Colorado River from the Wagner Ranch south of LaGrange, Texas, to the Johnsons. Dragging a sleeve across her face, she lifted her hat and fanned herself. Damn, it's hot and still early morning. That field's going to be a dusty bitch to work today. Sorry, David, Abby laughed. You've been gone too long and I've been listening to Dick. I'll try not to swear so much. She sighed and settled the hat in its place. I do miss you, you know. A long, gentle oxbow curve swept the river out and back through the flat land. Now, where is that silly soon-to-be husband of mine? He should have met me at our place, not theirs. Her thoughts slid back to yesterday evening. As they cleaned up at the Wagner spring house, Dick had soaked his bandana in the water bucket and washed her face. With the sweetest look, he'd leaned in and kissed her. You're like those fields out there. Abby smiled and caressed his cheek. How's that? You're both just waiting to be planted. Her face went hot and she cuffed his arm. Dick Johnson, your mother would wash your mouth out with lye soap. He'd laughed and kissed her again. It had felt so good, leaned against his back, her arms around him, his hand on hers as they rode back to LaGrange and Mary's. She'd laughed when at the back door he'd said, You're late. What do you bet? Mary'll look like she swallowed green persimmons. Abby bit her lip as her sister stormed into the kitchen, looking very much like the Persimmons were especially green and sour. Dick had interrupted Mary's rant. Abby's late because we finished the South Field today, something you've never done. Now she needs to eat and get a good night's rest. We plant tomorrow. Do not speak to me that way, young man, Mary snapped. Of course I have never. Ladies do not do any such thing. Ladies do what's needed for their families, Mary. You obviously haven't gone hungry. Mary gasped, mortified. He'd walked out the door, throwing a grin and a wink at Abby as he crossed the threshold. I do not know what it is you see in him, Abigail. He is so rude and uncouth. You must be more circumspect. You will not have a decent reputation at all. Mary, carry on all you want. I'm tired and going to bed. She'd heard Mary still spluttering as she climbed the stairs. So this is just the first part of this scene. It does continue beyond this point. But I wanted to stop here just to share some initial thoughts. The first point I would actually have is that this scene, I have a little extra context that you guys don't have. But after this scene is over, we actually meet one of a different main character, a different point of view character. We actually meet Abby's brother, David. And several months have passed since this scene, since this particular moment that we're looking at in this scene. Now, that to me signifies that this potentially is actually a prologue. It's not a chapter. It's not chapter 1. Prologues are where we take a piece of the story. It might be a glimpse into the future that actually takes place, say, after chapter 14 or 15. It could be a moment from the past, a piece of backstory. But either way, whether we're taking from future things that haven't happened in the story yet, or we're taking from the past, we're presenting the reader with this interesting hook that is outside of the beginning of the main plot line. And when we label that scene a prologue, we do something important in that we're communicating to the reader, this isn't the main story yet. The main story starts in chapter 1. But this is something that is taken from outside of that linear timeline and shared with you because it is important or it will become consequential at some point. And when we manage the reader's expectations in that way, they come into the prologue with a different set of expectations. They're thinking, maybe this is the main character, maybe it isn't, maybe it's a supporting character. And then when they start chapter 1, they kind of settle into the chapter and they know, okay, now the actual story has begun. So that was the first point I wanted to make. The next point I wanted to make was just kind of highlighting how much information we cover in just these initial paragraphs. We have Abby Wagner, our main character. We have a description of the Colorado River. We have a description of the Wagner Ranch south of LaGrange, Texas, to the Johnsons, I imagine Johnson's Ranch. So we have quite a few different locations covered in just one, really 4 different kind of place markers covered in just the first sentence. And then we're also introducing David, who is a character who is not present in the scene, but someone who Abby obviously thinks about and misses as she speaks to him. And then also the mention of Dick, another character who is not in the scene. And so my initial feeling there is quite a few different pieces of information for a reader to try and absorb as we step into this story. Obviously, we get an immediate sense of place, but do we want to meet 3 characters and cover 3 or 4 different location references in one paragraph? It's a little bit much in my mind. Also, the fact that David, Dick, phonetically and even visually, they're kind of similar names. They're a little interchangeable. I would love to really come at this scene more from a perspective of who is Abby? What is she doing? And why might we find her and the action that she's undertaking in this moment really compelling? Less is more. We do need to know who Dick is in this scene, as you'll see later on, for the action to carry its full sense of significance and drama. But we potentially don't need to introduce David, don't need to cover quite so much in just this opening section. As an initial impression, it's kind of saying, this writing is dense and you will need to work hard to keep up with everything that we're sharing. I think it's fun to try and go a little easier on the reader at the start and invite them into the journey, and not make them work quite so hard up front. I also note here we have a reference to, the oxbow curve that swept the river out, and back through the flat land. Potentially this is, we probably don't need to reference the river twice in such close proximity. So potentially, you can move the reference to the Colorado River into the next paragraph and kind of stagger the information a little bit more. My other point here was, whenever we have characters who speak aloud to themselves, now where is that silly soon-to-be husband of mine? He should have met me at our place, not theirs. For me, it feels a little, yes, I am someone who actually speaks aloud to themselves when alone, quite frequently. I don't know that I speak in quite such long sentences. And again, I kind of feel like we have this mixture of her having internal dialogue. I think in the original manuscript this was in italics, so it was a little bit clearer that she was thinking, damn, it's hot and still early morning, thinking that internally to herself. Then she's speaking aloud, sorry David, you've been gone far too long. And as she says this kind of line of dialogue and this one, and then down here, she's been talking to herself aloud quite a bit by that point. Is it a terrible thing? Obviously not. I think sometimes it can be a little distracting, can feel a little contrived when characters are speaking to themselves, particularly if they're speaking to themselves in a way that feels a little bit like they're introducing information to us, like we're putting words in their mouth as they explain, how much I miss David, I'm soon going to be marrying Dick. It feels, again, just a little contrived sometimes. So I try to avoid having characters speak aloud to themselves. I think in really extended kind of monologues. Other than that, we see her, she's walking, she's thinking of all the different people in her life, a little bit static, a little kind of potentially shifting into info dumping realm. But we have this lovely moment. I really liked this line, actually. It's a little raunchy. But Dick telling her that she's just waiting to be planted. I thought that's something a cowboy would say. So I really liked the authenticity of that. And obviously they have, a really kind of simmering chemistry, which is, again, going to become important soon. And then we effectively go into this part where Abby's walking in the present and thinking of the day prior when she was with Dick. And he said this very raunchy line to her, which I really liked. We have this line here where there's a kind of description of it had felt so good, leaned against his back, her arms around him, his hand on hers. Leaned against his back, almost to me sounds like she's leaning back, but then her arms are around him, and then his hand is on hers. So I thought the blocking there could possibly be a little bit clearer. Potentially even saying something, it had felt so good, riding behind him with her chin leaned against his, or cheek leaned against his broad back, or riding behind it against his broad back, her, cheek pressed to his warm shoulder, her hands around him. Again, not great examples that I'm offering here, but I thought just the relative position of their bodies and the blocking could be a little clearer. And then finally, really the decision to introduce us to Abby as she's walking. We have all of those different place references. We have references to David and Dick and, these important men in her life. Then she's thinking back to a moment that she shared with Dick, which is fine. But then on top of that, she's also then going deeper into that flashback or that bit of backstory exposition. And we're getting this actually extended scene of then going back to her sister's house, Dick having a kind of dispute with Mary, let's say. And, I think in the end, my point would be just how much do we want to cover in these initial paragraphs? We have her relationship with David, this missing person. We have her relationship with Dick, this man that she's falling in love with. Now we're covering Abby's relationship with her sister, who's obviously quite a harsh person, and is a bit critical and conservative and all of the rest of it. And that's fine, but as you'll see when we continue into the next section, we're just about to jump into some pretty extreme action and drama. And in my mind, when I really think about the priorities for this scene, there are two. One is understanding who Abby is and why we should empathize with her, why we should find her compelling and interesting. And two, understanding the depth and importance of her relationship with Dick. And you'll see why I'm saying that in a moment. Now, the fact that he stands up for her, to her sister, does show us, the reader, that he's, really got her back, and he's not afraid of being confrontational, and he's a bit of a protector for Abby. And Abby maybe is the kind of person who gets a bit trodden over, particularly by overbearing people like her sister. So even this flashback is telling us information around their relationship, but I still think it's a lot for this particular scene, especially given what is about to follow. So I would be inclined to, again, really pare it back and really focus on Abby and Dick and why, the context around their relationship and what makes it so special. So this really brings me to my key kind of point for opening scenes, and that really is, so many writers go into their opening scene, and I think that they carry this burden of all the things that they need to introduce to the reader. I want to introduce the time period. I want to introduce the location. I want to introduce all the main kind of characters, not just the main protagonist, but her love interest, her family members that are present, family members that are absent, the dynamics of those different relationships. And in the end, what we can do is we can take on so much that we're getting into this kind of setup and explainer mode, when really the reader is thinking, I don't care about any of this unless I care about the main character, or unless I care about the person who is the focus of this scene. Until the reader is emotionally invested in that main character, they have no real reason to find out more about that character's life. The significance of these other elements, of Mary, of David, etc., that significance comes once we have a connection to Abby and we care about what's happening to Abby, who is threatening Abby, who is an ally, who is an antagonist. What does Abby want? What is most important to her? What's standing in the way of that? Once we have cemented that foundation of understanding and empathy in the reader, all those other factors become more relevant. So it's great. It's not to say that we don't want to introduce the location, or we don't want to introduce the time period or anything else. We have to understand what the reader needs to know for the scene to make sense, for there to be enough context. But it's really helpful to come into these scenes with a very clear intention and agenda. I want the reader to cry for Abby in this scene. Now, if that is our intention, and you're going to see why in a moment, everything we introduce in this scene is around that. And maybe we need to meet Mary, maybe we need to reference David, maybe not. But first and foremost, we need to understand Abby and what makes her tick. So what does that look like? What makes us understand Abby and empathize with her? Well, I don't know too much about Abby. I haven't read the entire manuscript. I've really only focused on this initial scene. But if I look at what we've shared of Abby so far, she's a hard worker. She's planting that dusty bitch of a field. She, as we have explored with Mary, Mary's a bit of a lady, doesn't like getting her hands dirty, leaves all of the messy stuff to Abby. So Abby is someone who is tough, independent, has worked hard her whole life, and is now falling in love. And to me, that's a really interesting character to explore. What happens when you've spent your whole life grueling away in the fields? Your sister is the one who gets to act like a lady and be all feminine and pretty and have the fine things. You're the one who has to deal with the realities and practicalities of getting up at the crack of dawn every day to keep food on the table. And now suddenly you're in love. That, I think, offers so many opportunities to really present Abby to the reader in a way that is very human and vulnerable and also unique. when I look at the current introduction to Abby, she's dusty, she's wiping a sleeve across her face, she's thinking, oh, I have so much hard work today, I miss my brother David, or I'm thinking of my lover Dick. And I think in a way we get a sense of who Abby is. She's obviously a nice person, she seems young, we get a clear sense that she works hard, but she's not stepping out of that kind of just initial let's say figurine almost of young historical woman who is working in the field. I want to get deeper than that as quickly as possible, and really create an immediate impression of Abby's personality in a very unique manner. So, she's a hard worker, she's independent, she's toiling in the field. To me, that is someone who has had a pretty, tough life, who is probably quite hardened, and who isn't kind of like frolicking around the flowers and enjoying all of the joys of youth. She's someone who has to push herself every day in order to get everything done that she needs to get done. So maybe when we meet Abby, she's cursing herself. She's marching into the fields because it's well past her usual start time at dawn, and she's annoyed that she's starting later. Now it's going to be hot. Now she's going to bake under the sun. But she deserves it. She was silly enough to put a red ribbon in her hair this morning before blushing at her own vanity and pulling it out and tucking it back into her special box. I mean, imagine wearing ribbons in a dusty field. How ridiculous. Then she finally left the house. She had to turn back because she'd forgotten her hat. She remembered her canteen, thank the Lord, but she forgot to fill it. And of course she didn't forget the fresh bread and the hunk of beef or pork or whatever for Dick, along with a pickle, just as he likes it. But we really get a sense that she's like, why am I being so foolish, floating around, my head in the clouds, when there's work waiting? We sense that this man has crept under her skin like a nasty rash. And this is someone who is clearly in the throes of love, but someone who has come from a background and a context where frivolity is seen as a vulnerability. And potentially that's also a reflection of living with a person like Mary, as we find out later. Romance and roses and love, well, they're for Mary. She's a lady. For Abby, come on, be a bit more practical and pragmatic. You've got work to do, no time to fool around. So we can see in this scene, Abby is in love, but she's kind of warring with herself over it. And I think that that's instantly kind of interesting because there's tension in that. But also, as we focus in on how Abby is experiencing love for the first time and kind of, struggling with it, she's also kind of really revealing to us who she is, her values, her priorities. And in a sense, we're kind of also seeing what she really needs in life, which is to have a little more fun, to loosen up, to not be so hard on herself, to not punish herself for experiencing a little bit of joy or for allowing her head to be in the clouds for a moment. Now, let me add a caveat that this example is probably completely wrong for who Abby is and who she continues to be in this story. So this isn't necessarily, a developmental recommendation that I would give to Denise for this book, because it probably doesn't align with, the character that Abby already is. But it's more of an example, how do we peel back the surface level, I'm a young woman going to the field, it's dusty and hot, and I'm going to have to work hard today, but I'm in love, so I have something to look forward to give the reader something that maybe is a little bit a little more unique, a little more specific, a little more insightful, a little bit more focused on Abby's unique traits as a character and as a human being. So, as I said, we're not trying to introduce too much here. Abby's a hard worker, she's fallen in love, she's distracted and intoxicated by her feelings. It's not too saccharine. Now, as you're about to see later in the scene, some tragedy occurs. And I always feel when we have like a kind of saccharine setup, let's say, I'm a good person and I'm so in love with this guy and he's so sweet to me and so wonderful, and then something terrible happens, it always feels a little bit predictable in some ways. Or maybe the emotional manipulation feels a touch too obvious. If you show someone who's a little bit grumpy, but are obviously in love, who's kind of endearing, despite their apparent flaws, and then something tragic happens, I feel that it can feel a little bit more genuinely surprising. It can feel even more tragic, because instead of trying to present the reader with the perfect couple and then breaking them apart, you're presenting the reader with a real couple and then breaking them apart. And for me, that actually carries a greater sense of kind of pathos when the tragedy arrives. So we're really understanding Abby as the focal point of this scene, what makes her tick, why we should empathize with her and emotionally invest in her. And what I would also be looking to do, knowing that tragedy is around the corner, foreshadowing the fact that this is a hard world where people must toil to survive. Life is effort, life is danger. And I would be showing here that she's let her guard down, that she's been swept up in emotion. Will she be punished for that or rewarded? So maybe she's even, she usually carries a knife on her, but she realized she'd left it at home. She thinks, should I go back and get my blade? I don't need it. I'll be with Dick. I'm already late enough. I'll continue on. But we're like dropping little hints that something is amiss in this world. Something is slightly off its axis. Love has changed things for her. She's not as alert as she would usually be. She's not as organized as she would usually be. She's punishing herself for that. And as we see thematically later in the scene, that punishment comes tenfold as, the next kind of climactic moment comes about. So as we move into the second part of this scene, Abby's thoughts came back to the present as the path dipped over a swell. Abby brushed aside some new leaved-out black willows. Dick stood on the Johnson Ranch dock staring down the river. So sudden, it startled Abby. He turned and raced for the house. Shading her eyes, Abby puzzled. Why? Dick skidded to a halt on the dock, raising a rifle to his shoulder. 3 things happened in the same instant. Abby snatched up her skirts and ran, yelling, "Dick, no!" Dick fired, and shots flew from the boat. Dick spun and fell. Sobbing, screaming his name over and over, Abby ran. Rough hands tried to keep her from him, rougher voices laughing. Told her, "You want Dick? We'll give you Dick." She fought them until something hit her head hard. Abby stood outside the barn, clothes torn, scorched, smoldering. Searing smoke roiled thick with roaring flames around her. A horse at the far side of the corral screaming, running panicked against the rails. Nothing made any sense. End scene. I promised you drama, and that's what Denise has given us. A very, evocative scene for poor Abby, whose life is effectively crushed in an instant. So, thoughts. Now, what I would say here is, it's interesting to compare, even in terms of word count, how much we cover in the first part of the scene that I shared with you, where Abby is walking, and then we're going back to memories that she has of Dick, and then his conversation with her sister. And then we cover, so all of that is about, let's say, 2/3 of the word count. And then in this moment where everything collapses, Dick obviously spots people coming towards them. He then tries to fire. They kill him first. They grab her. They, I assume, sexually assault her. They then, we have the drama of the barn and the ranch and everything burning to the ground. All of that happens in such a short kind of word count. And I found that the first time I was reading this, I really had to go back through the text several times to understand what actually was happening, because it's so quick, it's almost difficult to kind of visualize the blocking and keep track. So Abby's thoughts come back to the present as the path dipped over a swell. She brushed aside some new leaved out black willows. American readers might understand that reference more than I did. I found it a little hard to visualize what that meant. We know what willows are. Black willows, I mentioned a variety of willow. I'd love to know though, because keep in mind, like, what Abby can and can't see is very important contextually in this scene. She's walking into a location that's full of risk and she can't see it. So, in my mind, when I picture her walking on, this kind of flat land, I'm almost imagining, as she goes over a swell, that there's a lot of space around her. She can see Dick in the distance. She can, things aren't necessarily kind of masked. I think if she's moving her way through brush, or if she's gone from an elevated level then down where she can't see anything anymore, she can just see Dick, or there's a big part of the river obstructed. I would be looking for subtle ways to kind of indicate that to the reader. As we continue on, we see Dick standing on the Johnson Ranch dock staring down the river. He turns and races for the house, shading her eyes, Abby puzzled why. Dick skidded to a halt on the dock. Consider the timing of this action. So Abby is watching him in the distance. She sees him standing on a dock, then turn and race for the house, and she's shading her eyes, puzzled what's going on. Now, let's imagine that the dock and the house are 100 meters from, one to the other, and he has to leave the dock, run, get inside the ranch, find his gun, which we assume is already loaded, come back, and then put it up and aim. I'm assuming that's going to take at least 15, 20, 30 seconds. Maybe if the two locations are really close to each other, even so, I'm thinking that's quite a long period of time. Now, Abby is effectively standing there, shading her eyes for 30 seconds, going, what's happening? She's not looking around. She's not, trying to see if there's some source of danger, what he's reacting to. She's just frozen. Well, all of this action, time-consuming action, happens around her. So think through the blocking, think through, because this tells us how far away is she from Dick? How far away is Dick from safety? How long would it take Dick to run to her? That might not all happen in the scene, but the more of that kind of spatial context we can give to the reader when there is a life and death sequence unfolding, the more all of this can be easier to visualize and can kind of make sense. Now, when we have him skid to a halt on the dock, raise the rifle, Abby snatched up her skirts and ran, yelling, "Dick, no!" To me, I'm kind of thinking, now, Dick has obviously seen something that he's very, very concerned about, that he needs to fire at. Abby has not seen what he's firing at. So it doesn't make sense to me that she would run towards him and say, "Dick, no." The first time I read this, I thought, she does know what he's firing at, and whatever he's firing at, he's about to make a terrible mistake. So for example, there is a group of people who are coming who look dangerous, but are in fact family friends of Abby's, and Dick is about to fire upon them. Given the action that we're seeing, it's very dramatic for Abby to snatch up her skirts and say, "Dick, no." But why is she saying no? She doesn't know what he's firing at. So again, there's just this kind of like slight sense of confusion. Now, as the scene continues, Dick fired and shots flew from the boat. Dick spun and fell. My first impression there, again, is because we're in Abby's point of view, what boat? This boat has suddenly we reference the boat in this paragraph almost as if we've already kind of established its presence in an earlier part of the scene, but actually it's just popping up completely out of the blue. Has Abby suddenly spotted this boat? Was it tucked behind some rushes or willows, and now it's kind of floated forward and she can see it? Again, we kind of really want to step out who can see what, why something was shielded from her before, hidden from view, but is now apparent. Is she running forward and then turning back so she can see more? These little details might sound super pedantic, but to really appreciate what's happening and whether we should empathize with her or judge her for running towards him versus running back to her own house, or all these micro choices that the characters are making in an instant, we want to kind of appreciate what the danger is. Is it a giant boat filled with 10 men? Is it a small kind of canoe filled with 2 men? It's a little tricky because everything is referenced in quite a sort of, it's a little vague and a little abstract. Rough hands tried to keep her from him. Rougher voices laughing told her, "You want Dick? We'll give you Dick." I don't know about the "you want Dick, we'll give you Dick" line. I mean, I'm not sure that it works. I would potentially rethink that. I do like the idea of them being super crude and cruel and taking pleasure in, the evil of that moment. But again, I'm kind of thinking what's the blocking here? Dick has been firing down the river, we imagine some distance. He has time to run back into his house and come back with his rifle. So there must be distances between all of these people and their targets. She has run towards Dick, and then suddenly rough hands are grabbing her. How much time has passed? So has she been bent over Dick's body, giving these men enough time to come up to her? Were they right behind her, chasing her down? Can we hear legs sloshing through the water as she passes them? It's a little tricky, again, to understand the timing. Why doesn't she pick up his rifle and defend herself, or shout for help in the ranch? We assume these ranch must have dozens of people living in them. Why are they alone? Why isn't there anyone around to help? A little bit more information, I think, could go a long way in terms of helping us appreciate, how this whole situation has come about, how he recognized to fire at them in the first place, how he knew immediately that they were a threat. I think this final section, Abby stood outside the barn, I really actually enjoyed the abstract nature of this, because it reflects Abby's state of mind in this moment. She's in a sense of shock. She's completely, potentially outside of her own body. She's disassociating. So she's just taking in fragments of the world around her. And Denise has expressed that really beautifully in just these, it's almost like a stanza from a poem, these brief kinds of sentences that just create these little horrifying visual vignettes of the chaos around her. For that section, as a reflection of her point of view, as a kind of general sense of the catastrophe, I think it works really well. But for the action leading up to that point, I think that there's room to get really clear on, the key elements. So for life and death action, clarity is quite important. Distance between the different figures, the timing of how long it takes someone to run a distance and what the other character is doing as that happens. Sight, who can see what? Why is something obscured and then suddenly becomes visible? It's not to say that we want to really pedantically slow down the pace of the scene and the pace of the action by adding too much detail, but you'd be amazed how a single sentence or a couple of words of extra context can really help us understand how the action is unfolding. So that brings me to the end of today's Run the Gauntlet. I want to thank you again for joining us. I want to thank Denise so much for running the gauntlet in this episode. Denise, I hope some of the points that we explored today will be really genuinely useful for you moving forward. And I would really invite everyone who has watched to share their comments. Were there any suggestions that I made that you felt missed the mark? Did you think that I potentially missed an opportunity that I could have discussed? Share your thoughts below, and I'm sure Denise will appreciate any constructive and supportive feedback that you want to share. And until the next Run the Gauntlet episode, I hope you all stay well and keep writing fabulous stories. Obviously, anyone interested in sharing their work with me for the next Run the Gauntlet program, please send it in. Or if you're interested in just developmental editing, check out my website. And I look forward to when our paths next cross. Take care.